After the westward expansion of the United States, Americans continued to move into and develop the western part of the country. Many people felt the need to protect the forests and wilderness from human development. In 1872, President Ulysses S. Grant signed a bill making Yellowstone the first national park in the United States. This was an environmental frontier in history, which led to the creation of the National Park Service in 1916. The National Park Service has since protected nature and wildlife in the U.S. for over a century and has created a place for the public to enjoy and learn about nature so they can protect the national parks for future generations. Even though Yellowstone was the first national park, it was not the first piece of protected land in the U.S. On June 30th, 1864, President Lincoln granted Yosemite Valley to the state of California. This was the first time that land had ever been set aside for public use and protection. This also influenced the decision to turn Yellowstone into a national park. In 1871, the U.S. government appointed Ferdinand Hayden to lead an expedition into Yellowstone. Up until that point, Yellowstone remained a relatively unexplored area of the West. Hayden and his team changed that. They explored the Yellowstone region and conducted many experiments on the natural resources. A team of photographers and artists also accompanied Hayden on his expedition through Yellowstone. Thomas Moran was one of the artists and was able to capture the stunning beauty of many of Yellowstone's great features, such as lakes, mountains, and hot springs. Moran was greatly remembered for his paintings and even received the nickname Thomas Yellowstone Moran. When Hayden returned, he presented his reports of Yellowstone and the paintings by Thomas Moran to U.S. congressmen and strongly urged them to turn Yellowstone into a national park. Due to Hayden's influence on the legislators, less than a year later, President Grant signed the bill making Yellowstone a national park. Fortunately, almost as soon as it was discovered, it was dedicated and set apart for the benefit of the people, a piece of legislation that shines benignly amid the common dust and ashes history of the public domain, for which the world must thank Professor Hayden above all others, naturalist John Muir. The creation of Yellowstone was a momentous event. However, there were still many challenges and problems for the park to overcome to get to where it is today. One of the biggest challenges the park faced in the early days was lack of funding. The first superintendent was unable to accomplish much. However, in 1877, the second superintendent, Philetus Norris, was appointed. He helped the park get up and running by building roads, a headquarters at Mammoth Hot Springs, and pushed for a stop to hunting in the park. Despite the positive changes made, Yellowstone still struggled with getting staff to maintain the park. To solve this problem, Congress sent in the Army on August 20, 1886, to strengthen and enforce rules and regulations. The troops were able to guard major attractions, evict violators from the park, and helped maintain regulations and posts. The biggest threat to troops were poachers who endangered bison species. If troops caught poachers, the maximum punishment they could enforce was banishment from the park, meaning the poachers could re-enter the park after they left. A well-known journalist named Emerson Howe witnessed the arrest of Ed Howell, who was poaching bison. Howe published a story in a popular magazine, which received the attention of Congress. 2 months later, the National Parks Protection Act was passed, increasing the Army's authority and control. This was very important as it was one of the first laws ever made to protect wildlife. The Army was able to greatly improve the state of Yellowstone. However, they couldn't educate visitors about the parks, and after all, the Army wasn't meant to regulate Yellowstone. On August 25, 1916, President Woodrow Wilson passed the National Park Service Act. This created the National Park Service, which was an organization with workers who were trained to regulate and educate the public about the national parks. This organization has lasted for over a century and continues to grow and improve the national parks. The creation of Yellowstone National Park led to many other national parks. One of the most notable changes after Yellowstone was in 1890, when Yosemite transitioned from a state park to a national park. Naturalist John Muir visited Yosemite for the first time in 1868 and was one of the main advocates for this change. Muir saw how the sheep and livestock grazing was damaging the land and published an article in the newspaper. This sparked the interest of Congress, and a year later, Yosemite became a national park. In 1903, John Muir took Teddy Roosevelt on a 3-day camping trip through Yosemite. As John Muir guided Teddy Roosevelt through Yosemite, Roosevelt was able to see and experience the exquisite beauty of the wonders in Yosemite. Throughout the trip, Muir and Roosevelt talked about the importance of protecting and preserving nature, especially Yosemite. The camping trip and John Muir influenced Teddy Roosevelt to create 5 national parks, 18 national monuments, 55 national wildlife refuges and bird sanctuaries, and 150 national forests, spanning over more than 100 million acres. The national park system has lasted for over a century. However, this is not a perfect system, and the national parks have faced many challenges over the years. After World War II, the visitation of the national parks increased greatly. This started Mission 66, a 10-year plan to improve the infrastructure of the national parks. Mission 66 improved and built roads, creating easier access to the national parks, improved employee housing, and, most importantly, created visitor centers, a new concept at the time, to educate and answer visitors' questions. However, Mission 66 was very controversial. Many worried that it would modernize the national parks too much and take away from the flora and fauna of the national parks. Yellowstone has been around for more than 150 years. However, the park has faced many challenges. In the early 1900s, the bison population was hunted to less than a dozen, and in the 1980s, wildfires destroyed nearly a third of the park. However, Yellowstone has overcome these challenges. Now Yellowstone's ecosystem is healthy and thriving. Today, the national parks face problems such as employee housing, climate change, an increase in visitation, and managing and protecting wildlife. Recently, the national parks received a grant from the Great American Outdoors Act, providing them with $1.3 billion per year for 5 years to address environmental and climate issues by improving restrooms, trails, roads, visitor facilities, and infrastructure. The founding of the national parks was very important. However, there is a portion of the national parks history that is often left untold. Those who created and founded the national parks, like John Muir and Ferdinand Hayden, claim to have found bare and untouched lands. However, that isn't entirely true. The majority of the land that is now the national parks belonged to the indigenous peoples for thousands of years, before the Europeans discovered the U.S. The U.S. federal government forcibly removed native peoples from their homes. They set aside small reservations for them to live on and revoked their hunting rights, an important part of their livelihood and culture. This is an important piece of the national parks history that we need to acknowledge and learn about. The national parks play a major role in protecting the air, water, and land in this country, while also creating a space for people to enjoy and learn about nature so they can continue to protect the national parks for the next generations. Today, the national parks continue to grow and thrive and will keep expanding to accommodate and educate more people while continuing to protect one of our most valued resources, nature. I have done the best I could to show forth the beauty, grandeur, and all-embracing usefulness of our wild mountain forest reservations and parks, with a view to enticing the people to come and enjoy them, and get them into their hearts, that so at length their preservation and right use might be made sure. John Muir. Even now, his legacy lives on, encouraging us to appreciate and help protect our national parks.